Yeah, so the title ReVision comes from a couple places for me. So I was thinking about how my work often nods to or directly references art history, and so I'm looking at classical sculptures and borrowing some fragments of certain poses. So in the show here, there's a leg with a hand on it that was taken from the discus thrower sculpture. There's a pointing finger, pointing arm that was, for me, like a callback to Napoleon crossing the Alps, a painting. And so there's just things like that, like looking at art history and then borrowing it, but recontextualizing it, rethinking how I want to show it, breaking it down a little bit more. So I think that's like something that runs through all of my work. And then for this particular show, there's also the element of revising or rethinking the installation, how the works come together. So my work usually begins with making lots of parts that are interesting to me for various reasons, and they could come together in lots of different ways. And in an exhibition like this, ultimately I choose one way, that's the final presentation that people see, and then the show sits there for 2 or 3 months in that form. And it felt like this was a great opportunity, with Milwaukee being so close to where I live, and the space being open to more experimental approaches, that I could come and play around with that installation and not just have it live as one final statement, as they often do, but give me a chance to rethink the show after it's been up for a little bit, and experiment and play around with different ways that these same forms could be presented. So when I first visited Hawthorne Contemporary, maybe two years ago now or so, I love the lighting in the space because of the evenness of it. And yeah, I've worked in other spaces like Atlanta Contemporary, where you flip on the switches and wherever something is, it looks good, it's lit, as you can see it. And I've worked in other spaces where there's traditional can lighting and it's much more dramatic, and you have to think about shadow much more and things like that. But in this particular show, with this idea that I'm going to be moving things around and changing the install, I feel like it allows me to be more open in what I do, because the lighting isn't it's less of a player in the decisions that I make. I could see if there was a really dramatic spotlight somewhere, not wanting to move a piece out of it, even though you can change the lighting and everything, but it's just like one more thing to consider. And so I feel like this becomes a blank page almost, that doesn't, the lighting doesn't change. And so that's one element that I don't need to think about. I also was interested in the grid that the lights are positioned in. And so the pedestals, the 3 medium-sized pedestals that are in the space, they were made to the dimensions of the lights. And they're positioned under a light always. And so I wanted just that really subtle kind of relationship to the space. So I often consider my work site sensitive, so it's not site specific, like this could be shown other places, but I like to pull characteristics of certain spaces and bring that into the work in a way so it feels like it belongs in that space. And so the lighting, the rectangle of the lighting fixtures was one way that I did that, and kind of maintaining a little bit of a grid as well. Like it gets a little chaotic in the middle, but I'm still keeping things pretty much like parallel to the walls. Yeah, my first vision for the show, when you first asked me to do a show and I saw the lighting, I was like, oh, I'll have one pedestal under each light. And then I quickly was like, that's insane. And a little too structured for what I like to do. So my work it often begins as a response to the gaze, or just the dynamics inherent in the act of looking at bodies. And so the male gaze, or I actually prefer to call it the patriarchal gaze, because more about an ideology than an identity. That's the dominant way that bodies have been represented in culture. And my work is sometimes framed as reversing the male gaze. And I don't really think of it as exactly that. Like, it's not just flipping the script of like, oh, like women's bodies have been objectified historically, and so now I'm going to objectify the male body. It's more like trying to present the body in a way that does more justice to the complexity of how we see the bodies, how they can be represented, the kind of expression that they can have. The patriarchal gaze, I think what's harmful about it is that it creates caricatures of bodies, of like, it makes us see them as one-dimensional, and the way they're represented is stereotypical and oversimplified, and so the male body often is represented as strong and heroic and authoritative and things like that, and there's less room for vulnerability and softness and weakness and awkwardness and things like that. And so I want the work to kind of weave all of those things together, and I feel like those are qualities that, regardless of your gender expression or the kind of body you have, is part of the human condition. Like, it's like something that everyone can relate to, and so I'm focusing on the male body here to kind of keep the conversation concise, and I feel like there's a lack of representation of the male body from perspectives that are not other males, and so it's interesting to me to be a woman who's focusing on the male body and thinking about how that makes it seem different to people when they find out that the artist is a woman. But really, like, the things that I'm interested in are about people and what it's like to move through the world in a body and want to be seen in a complex way. Yeah, so I'm using a range of materials in the show that I feel like complement each other really well, because their qualities are so different, yet they allow me to represent the body with such clarity. The bodies are still like very legible, even when it's a silicone torso kind of in a pile, like we still recognize it. And so there's a movement in the show between forms that are really solid and fixed and firm, and forms that seem like they could be repositioned differently. They're much softer. They're a flaccid quality to them. So I like the way the softer forms counter representations that we have often seen of, in particular, the male body, but in classical sculpture in general. I sometimes think about a limitation of sculpture that has kind of pushed me into other media like video and performance and things, is that you have this one final form that is fixed, and we ask so much of it, like this form. Often, like, I want it to do so many things, but it's static. It's staying that way forever. And so with the silicone, I love that I can reposition it, and even if I'm not changing it during the show, just the fact that people can tell that it's not fixed, that it could jiggle, that it could move. Just the possibility of movement, I think, adds something to that contrast that I'm after. So there are ceramic forms in the show that are they're more abstract in their form, but they're glazed and sculpted with surfaces that are bodily in the sense of the inside of the body, and to me that just highlights something about our vulnerability, and like especially in classical sculpture, there's so much emphasis on the exterior, and it's this polished, smooth surface that feels impenetrable. And then, but if we think about how our bodies really are, and how, like, our skin being permeable, and how soft our skin is, and how easily we can get injured and things like that. I liked having a reminder in the show of, like, our soft insides without putting, like, guts on display. Yeah, so the plaster sculptures in the show are made from a process called life casting. And so they are created by taking a direct impression off of a real person's body. So I invite models to the studio, and I buy a body-safe silicone that I can smear on their body, and it's usually a 2 or 3 hour process, and with assistants helping me, where the model is holding still, as still as they can for that long period of time, and I'm making the mold directly on their body. And I love this process because the results are so close to the actual person. You know, you can see the details of their skin that I suppose I could sculpt, but, like, it just captures so immaculately, you know, the pores and the wrinkles, and hair from their body gets embedded in the silicone and then will get stuck into the plaster. And so it really is a reminder of this specific person who was present with me in my studio and was kind of becoming sculpture through the process. And so it's, so that's a process that I rely on heavily in the studio. But I never cast an entire body. You know, usually I'm interested in a specific gesture or the body, kind of creating a composition with the body that I find really interesting, such as the knees with the hands draped over them. You know, like the way the body is kind of folding in on itself was really interesting to me, and that's all I needed to capture. I didn't need an entire body head to toe, and that would be, like, really hard, you know, a process that wouldn't be worth the trouble it would take to capture that. Because I like having parts. I like having pieces that can then be, I can figure out later how to present them in ways that encourage the viewer to fill in the rest of the body. Like, it gives some room for the viewer to insert their own vision into it as well. And sometimes I feel like it's more powerful to not see the whole body and leave that room, leave a little bit of ambiguity, and I enjoy that. And so once I have parts made, like, I often, in my studio, I have different stages that I go through. I'll just be making a lot of molds for a while, doing a lot of casting for a while, and then I've accumulated enough parts where I have to figure out how I'm actually going to get them in space, you know. And so I rely heavily on just raw construction materials like lumber, or sometimes I use metal rod or threaded tubing to suspend these pieces. And I like the rawness of those materials in relation to the meticulous surfaces and the more highly crafted form of the body. Like, to me, it's a really great contrast. And I think of the structures that I'm creating to support the fragments as armatures, and sometimes they literally were armatures in the process. So the sculpture with the arms wrapped around the basketball, that is the structure that the molds were made on. It was a structure that allowed the model to hold that pose while the molds were being made. And you can see residue of that process on there. You can see plaster and silicone still on it. And I like having that residue there. You know, I like people being reminded of, you know, how it happened. It didn't just magically appear, but there was a long iterative process that resulted in the sculpture. And so some of the sculptures actually were armatures for live bodies, and then they become an armature to support the sculpture in the gallery. So when I work with models, it is a combination of planned things that I want to do with them, and then responding to things that just happen organically during my time with them. So when I have a session with a model, I usually have what I call a set list, or like a list of things that I want to try, and sometimes it's mold making, and then a little bit of video, and then some drawing. Usually I work for I'll have a model come for a few days and stay in the studio, so it's a really intensive weekend or something. And even when I know, I want to make a mold of this pose or this, the body doing this, once the model is there, we sit down and kind of work through what that actually looks like, and it usually shifts and changes a little bit once I see their actual body in the pose. And then I have to decide, how to crop that fragment, where do I stop the mold and things like that. So there's always some improvisation with the model. And with the photography and video, I'll have a list of things like, I have these, in the photo behind me, Dan at rest, I had these sawhorses that I liked, and I was thinking about the trend at the time of planking, and I was like, it's the opposite of planking, you can be like a limp noodle, and so I was like, I just want you to be as soft as possible, but while being, using these sawhorses. And so that was, I was surprised at how flexible his body was that could bend like that. And it was just a really compelling, when I saw it in the studio, I knew there was something there that would make an interesting image. And then with the video, I usually have a prompt, I want you to respond to this, or play with this, or I'm gonna throw a sheet over you, and then I want you to do this, and then we just see what happens. And I shoot tons and tons of video that never really gets seen because it's not actually as interesting as it was in my head. Yeah, so when I'm installing, I come to a space I try to have a certain openness to what the work could be. And there are certain strategies that I've used before and that I find visually appealing for whatever reason, the casualness of clamping something, or I love piles of things. And so when I was installing with my assistant, that's one of the first things I said. I was like, I like piles, I like things draped, I like things leaning, so just keep that in mind as we're working. And I think partially I'm responding to the form, the typically formal quality in a gallery, and wanting to push against that, and just allow myself to not feel like I have to fall into that. So I do have framed drawings in the show, which is the first time I've ever shown drawings, and also first time I framed them. But there's so much else in the show that is much more casually presented. So like the photograph that's clamped up, and for me that was just being like, well, why would this photograph need to be framed, or why does it need to be flapped? Like, why can't I let the paper curl, and maybe that curling paper relates to the softness of the figure that's represented, and so for me it makes sense in those ways. Yeah, so I'm going to be reinstalling the show two more times throughout the run of the exhibition. And that's really exciting to me because I want to play in the space. Like installing a show is one of my favorite things about being an artist. I spend all this time making parts that I can play with, that I can put together in various ways. And when I finally put them together, either to create a singular composition that becomes a sculpture, or I put them together to create a composition that's an installation in a show, it's satisfying for a little bit, and then I feel restless again of like, oh, but what if I did that, and what if it looked like this, or you know, and I'm always wondering like, how could I push myself more, like maybe this is too safe, like maybe I'm just, you know, relying too much on those habits that I have of using the piles and the leaning things and the clamped things. And so this show gives me the opportunity to question those things and try out some different things and see what can happen. And so I don't know what it's going to look like right now, and that's exciting to me.